we tend to talk all the time. Paul lives in Madrid, so we're texting each other and speaking all the time, and sharing thoughts and sharing preoccupations. One preoccupation ongoing, I think, preoccupies everybody really, is this huge waste of a generation, where there's a million kids, young people out of work across the country, and for which they're blamed. And it's their fault they're out of work, of course, despite the fact there ain't no jobs. So we talked about that, and there's obviously several obvious films to make about that, but we thought, well, let's try and do something about it that tells the story, but sees them in a positive light, sees them involved in a project. And Paul then sketches down some characters and a possible narrative for them way they might develop. And then we talk about that, and then Paul writes the first draft, and then it goes backwards and forwards. But the idea for Robbie and the idea for the whiskey came from Paul.
Francine, maybe I could just say one thing as well. Since we've got the Glasgow connection, I just jumped in for the last couple of minutes there, and it was nice to see the men in blue in Glasgow. And I would just like to send my commiserations to Mr. David Cameron having Mr. Andy Coulson arrested and dragged up to Glasgow. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he's innocent. I think I'm just obviously a communist plot, an innocent man in the heart of government, right at the heart of the cabinet. So I'm sure it's all lies. He's just another setup. It's actually confused me. I've never had such deep respect, and in my eyes, I almost feel emotional when I see these men in blue now. I just. Poor old Andy, eh? Oh, God. In the dock, 8 hours up the road, eh? Love to have been in the car.
Maybe another screenplay another day.
Yes.
But the idea of the whiskey, I can see that you would both have been concerned about the predicament of the young unemployed. But where did the whiskey come in?
I hope this film hasn't put off malt whiskey drinkers. My brother-in-law, Angus McConnell, he comes from the islands, and I think his mum used to enjoy the odd tipple. And Angus is a great man to sit and talk about life, and you get wiser and wiser as you have more whiskey, I've noticed. And I suppose Angus gave me a taste for it, and also just the joy of drinking and company. But what kind of fascinated us about whiskey was that it's got lots of levels to it. There's actually the craftsmanship, and there are brilliant people who make this and understand it, and there is a science to it, and also an art to it, I think. And there's also, it's a world that you can actually discover bit by bit, which was very good for our characters. But I suppose what fascinated us too was the fact that this is Scotland's national drink. It's promoted, it's a multi-million, if not billion-pound industry. But many of the young people, like the Robbies of this world, have never tasted whiskey. And what's even more surprising really is how many have never been to the countryside. You might be surprised about how many have not been up to these beautiful places where it's distilled. And on top of all of that, there's another lovely level that we just couldn't resist, was the pretension. These people who spend, £100,000 on a bottle of whiskey. And that's not a joke. There are bottles on sale for now for 100,000. And, and it's nothing to do with them tasting it. It's to demonstrate their power and ego. And so that vulgarity was too much to miss, really, as well. So it gave us, we felt maybe mixing that with the community service payback was a kind of a wonderful kind of set of reference to wind a little story.
And it's also the contrasting system of values, isn't it? Because you're valuing something that intrinsically has no value, the whiskey, except for the craft that goes into it. But it's only because everybody else values it that it gets to be quite so sought after. And then there's this great resource of all these young people who are not valued in that sense. So that brew, like the whiskey, that's kind of fermenting and getting better in the cask. How long does it take, the two of you, to come up with something which is the final screenplay?
Actually, it's the actual writing of it, touch wood, and maybe tempting fate here, doesn't take too long. But actually, I think listening is greatly underestimated, and really, I think the most creative work in a sense is actually beforehand. It's kicking ideas about. It's like, because you ask the biggest question that we always try to ask ourselves is like, why this story? That's the most important question. And I suppose, as Ken mentioned earlier on, it was out of this, I suppose, a sense of fury that so many young people's lives are just written off at an early stage. And because statistics are bandied about all over the place. There's over 1 million in Britain. There's 53% young people, 18 to 24-year-olds in Spain, for example, who don't have, who will not work. And it's the rest around many other cities, countries in Europe. But when you're actually sitting talking to people, I mean, that's when it really gets you. I remember as we're speaking just now, a young lad called Connor comes to mind. And I went out to the east end of Glasgow, where Paul's from, Paul Brannigan, the main actor. And we had a big chat with a whole bunch of them. And I remember asking them, I said, right, how many jobs have you applied for in the last 6 weeks? And Connor said, 210, like that. You know, I said, how many interviews have you got? None. But what really got me was, it wasn't even replied to, you know? It was just ignored. And he goes, how do you deal with that? I said, I've stopped doing it now because it's absolutely pointless. And when you hear kids like that and you see their faces, and it's almost like a life sentence, because the likelihood they will not work in their lives. In the east end of Glasgow, where Paul comes from now, there are some areas where there's up to the 5th generation who have not worked, you know. And so it's little surprise that in these parts of the cities, it's like a vacuum. There's a great deal of self-destruction, a great deal of violence, frustration, and anger. And so I suppose that was the starting off point. And so kind of feeling that, and you can't copy a screenplay off the street, but all of these things and these people, and listen to the world and trying to see the world from their point of view, informs you. And that all sounds very, very tragic, but also when you're with them, I mean, they take the piss, they tell you jokes, the wild things that happen. You can see their wit and intelligence. Sometimes we'll work with these people in films. And my name is Joe, Sweet 16. I remember some of these people, it was their first job ever, and they were up there first thing in the morning, and their eyes lit up with the idea of having a project. And that's the bit that really informs the screenplay. So the writing's quite quick, but it's finding all about that and finding like why we should do it, and it gives you a sense for the spine of the story.
And of course, crucial to that is the casting. And in this case, your central character, Robbie, Paul Brannigan, was not an experienced actor. I mean,
No, he's a lad from the east end of Glasgow, as Paul was saying. And Paul met him doing the research, and we auditioned him along with hundreds of others. And he made every shortlist as we went on, and he got real emotional range. He got depth. Very quick on the draw, always got a riposte, and a natural sense of eloquence, which I think is very important. You know, use his language with balance and rhythm. So yeah, I mean, we could have cast it many times. I mean, there were many people who could do it, but in the end, you think, well, this is the lad we'll go with. But just following on briefly from what Paul was saying, I mean, it does strike you that now the things that, I mean, looking around the audience, I can see that most of us would have taken for granted a job, a possibility of a secure home, a planned way to bring up your families. To ask for that now, it's a revolutionary demand. You know, it's a revolutionary demand because the system just can't provide it. And it's very interesting that, I mean, my memory goes back further than most, but I mean, I seem to remember politicians promising full employment. That was part of what they promised 30, 40 years ago. Nobody mentions that now. And we take for granted that we will just write these kids off, and older people as well. And older people are told you've got to work longer for your pensions. Meanwhile, we keep the younger ones out of jobs and out of that ability just to plan their lives and have some sense of security. And what are we doing is just criminal. Really is criminal. And until we take it on board and make these demands, so it will go on. But anyway, that's in parentheses.
Can I just add one thing in parentheses? Yeah.
Double brackets.
It's only because there are a lot of lawyers here tonight, that's why. But it was funny watching The Bicycle Thieves from 1948, just before we went out to Cannes. I watched it with my kids. I mean, I'm sure everybody will have seen it. But again, it's a man just needing the dignity of work. And surprisingly enough, that was the same year, 1948, that they signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that's about 64 years ago, if my arithmetic's roughly correct. But Article 23 says everyone has the right to work. I mean, I find that absolutely remarkable, that this document, after the war, sets out the template for, you know, the minimum for a decent life. And that right that's enshrined in international law, this incredibly important, iconic document, now just seems so far from reality. And for, you know, hundreds of thousands, more and more, every month now, are getting further and further away from that right. You know, and as Ken says, that just seems simply to be accepted. You know, but if it was your kid or your brother or your grandchild or whatever, I mean, I think you would just boil with fury that they would never have the possibility of being independent and building a dignified life.